In this video or next few series of videos, we're going to be creating this application from scratch, which contains some amazing animations and interactive icons from Rive. This application contains a custom sidebar and a custom bottom tab bar with these animated icons. In the first part of this series, we're going to be creating this OnBoarding UI from scratch with a custom SignIn modal with validations. So if we submit the empty fields, it's going to show us an error, and if we input the correct fields, it's going to show us a success with a confetti animation at the end. So before I start, I want to thank the original creators of this application, Design Code, as this application is inspired and is part of this original SwiftUI plus Rive course instructed by Mentor, where he teach how to create this application using SwiftUI from scratch, also teach how to create your own custom Rive animated assets in the Rive editor in the form of video as well as article. So if you want to learn about SwiftUI and Rive, I would highly recommend you to check out this course as it is completely free, and the course link will be available in the description. So I have done the initial setup of the project. Like in the assets, we have fonts. These are the three main fonts that we will use in our application. These are the Rive files that we will use as an interactive animated assets in different part of our applications. And these are the images that we will use in our application. In the YAML file, first of all, I've installed the Rive package in the dependencies, using which we can control these Rive assets according to our needs, like showing confetti when the sign-in completes, button touch effect when user press on it, and all the different use cases. The assets are defined here with folder path to different directories where we've stored our PNG and Rive files. Similarly, fonts are defined here. And now we can directly access the font using the family name Inter or Poppins, and based on the weight, it will assign the correct font to the text. Lastly, we have our theme.dart file, in which I've just defined some of the common colors that we will use throughout our application. So this was the initial setup that I have done, and you also need to do if you want to follow along. The final code will be available in the description, which you can use as a reference to get some of these assets and configurations. Now, as we have gone through the initial setup, let's start with the UI. And the first screen that we're going to work on is the onboarding and the sign-in view. So for that, let's create a folder, onboarding, and inside that, I'm going to create a file, onboarding_view.dart. Now, I also want to thank Gordon Hayes from Fun with Flutter channel, as he did some minor changes in the application to improve performance. So a little bit of code that you're going to see as part of this project is his contribution. Now first, of course, we have to create the stateful widget and give it a class name, which I'm going to give onboarding view. And it's going to take a container scaffold. Now currently we have this black screen. That is mainly because in the main.dart file, it provided an empty container. So we can change that to onboarding view. And now we have scaffold as a container. Let's start with the UI, but first close this sidebar. And the scaffold takes a body, and the body is going to take the stack as a child. Now we're using stack because we need a background, and the content will be rendered above that. So a stack is the ideal widget for that purpose. So the first child for this is going to be the image widget. It's going to take the path to the image that we want to render, which is the spline image. Now we want to center this image on the screen. We're going to use that center widget. And to give the image its original dimension, we're going to pass it the fixed width and height and give the fit value to boxfit.cover. This, by the way, is the original dimension of this particular image. Now we want this image to be shifted a little to the bottom right, and for that we can use the transform widget and give it an offset of x 200 and y 100. Now it is shifted to the bottom right, but the area that was outside the screen bound is getting clipped. So to avoid that, we can wrap it around with an overflow box and give it a max width of double infinity. This will allow the image to overflow the container and take its maximum size. Now as we're using this, we can get rid of this hard-coded width and height, and it's going to look the same. Now we cannot really use this as a background, so we're going to blur this, and for that we're going to use another widget, which is ImageFilter, which takes the image filter as the property, and the value for this is going to be imported from .ui, the ImageFilter class, and it's going to take the blur value of 50. And when we save, it's going to apply a nice blur on the image. So our first background of our onboarding view is completed. Now the second background is actually a Rive asset. And to render a Rive asset, we have to import the Rive package and use the widget Rive animation. And inside the asset function, we're going to pass the path to the Rive file. And this is the Rive animation for this particular file. Now if you look at this file in the Rive editor, we see that this is a bunch of different shapes that move around on the screen in a loop. Now I'm not really going to cover how to create this animation, as it is already covered in great detail in the original course. So I'm going to put the link to that in the description. So if you want to learn the process behind this, or to get an idea about how to create similar animation of your own, you can check that out. So let's get back to the code. And we also have to apply the blur on this Rive asset, and we're going to use the same widget, ImageFiltered, and give it a blur value of 30. And it's going to apply the blur on this asset too. So now our background for the onboarding is done. And just for the information, this blur effect could also be achieved using another widget, that is backdrop filter. But the difference between backdrop filter and ImageFilter is that the backdrop filter applies the blur on all the widgets that are below it, unlike ImageFilter, which will only apply the blur on the widgets that we provide to it as a child. Like if I set the blur value for the spline to 0, you see that the blur on the Rive asset doesn't affect the spline image. And so that's the main difference. And the another reason is we kind of want a different blur value for both these assets. So that's another reason that we're using the image filter instead of backdrop filter. So now that the background is ready, next is to render the content. And for that, I'm going to use the safe area widget so that our content doesn't draw below the notch. And it's going to take a column so that our content is rendered one after the other in a vertical direction. And it's going to take first child as the title text, that is learn, design and code. And as it is a title, I'm going to give it a style of font size of 60 so that it is big enough. Now in this text, we're going to apply a custom font that we have defined in the YAML file. And as it is a title, it is going to be the font family of Poppins. Now as you see that this text is wrapped on a new line. So to avoid that, we can wrap it around with a container and give it a fixed width of 260. Now this text is going to look the same on all the different devices. And next, let's give it a padding so that our content has some spacing from the borders. So all the directions have padding of 40 except the top, where we have extra padding of 80. Now let's render the subtitle, and it's going to have the style of black, color black with 70% opacity, font family of Inter, and font size of 17. Now if you see, our content is by default centered. So to align it to the left, we can pass a property, cross-axis alignment to start. So now content is aligned to the left. Next, let's add a padding to the container, the title container, for a little spacing between these two. And next, I'm going to add a size box for a spacing below this subtitle. And next, I'm going to use container for the button. And it's going to have a fixed width of 236 and height of 64. Now, if you're wondering where I got these values from, then we're going to use this button as the button background. And if you see the configuration, you can see that this is the dimension assigned to this particular button. So that's where we got this value from. And if you look at this button, you see that this provides us this nice little touch effect. Now this also is a custom-made animation that is explained in detail in the original course. So I will put the link to that in the description, so if you want to learn how to create this button, the process behind it, or to get an idea about how to create similar animation of your own, you can check that out. So let's go back to the code, and the container is going to take a child, which is going to be a stack, because the Rive asset is going to act like a background and it's going to have the text that's going to be rendered above. So for the Rive asset, we're going to use the Rive animation widget, and it's going to take the path to the Rive asset and the fit value to cover. So the asset is rendered. Now we need some text, some label on the button so that the user know what this button do. And for that, I'm going to use a row, which is going to take an icon. And if you see, this icon is not centered. So to center it, we're going to use the center widget. So to center it vertically. And now to center it on the row, we're going to use the property main axis alignment on the row so that it's centered horizontally. Now let's also add another widget, that is text, to start the course, and give it a style of font size of 16, font family of inter, and font weight of bold. Let's add a size box for the little spacing between these two. Now if you see, this text and arrow are not really exactly centered on the white background of the button. That is mainly because of the extra spacing taken by this orange background. So to get around this, we can wrap this row with the transform widget and pass an offset of x4 and y4. Now our label is perfectly centered on the white button background. Now our button is ready, but we also need some shadow around that button. So for that, we can use a decoration on the container, and the decoration is going to take the box shadow, which is going to take the box shadow with black color with 30% opacity, blur radius of 10, and offset of width of 0 and height of 10. So we get this nice shadow around the button. Now let's also add the radius on the container to match the style of the button. So now our button is completed. Next, add the footer text and give it a text style of black color with 70% opacity and font family of inter and font size of 30. Let's add a size box with height of 16 to add a little spacing between these two. Now this title and subtitle should be at the top, and the button and footer should be at the bottom. To do that, we can add a spacer here so that the column will align the button and the footer to the bottom based on these extras available area. Next, the UI for the onboarding is completed. The last thing we need, when we click on the button, we need to detect the user's gesture and activate the touch animation on the button. So we cannot use the built-in button provided by the Flutter, mainly because they have their built-in touch effect, and we don't want that because we are using Rive asset, which has its own animation. So the another way to detect the gesture is using gesture detector widget. So we can wrap this container around with the gesture detector, and to listen to the tab, we can use the on tab callback. Now that we can detect the gesture, we need to control the animation for this asset, and for that we're going to use something called Rive animation controller from the Rive package, which is of course going to control the animation for a particular Rive asset. And now we need to initialize this controller on init state. Inside this, we're going to initialize this to one shot animation with an animation value of active. Now one shot animation is basically an animation where after the animation is complete, it auto reset to its initial value. Like when we want to activate the button to show the touch effect, we're going to set the value to true, and after the animation is complete, we don't have to manually set it back to false. It's going to auto reset to its original value. And we have applied the autoplay to false so that it doesn't autoplay when it first renders on the screen. And of course, lastly, we have to dispose this controller on the dispose callback. Now, controller is initialized, but we have to tell this controller a particular asset that it needs to control. And for that, we're going to use the controller property in the Rive animation widget. It takes the array of Rive animation controllers. And in the array, we can pass a button controller. Now, this controller knows that it needs to control this particular Rive asset. And we're getting this error, so we have to refresh this app. Now, lastly, just on the OnTap callback, we're going to have to set the isActive value of this controller to true. And now when we click on the button, you see that we get this nice little touch effect. So our UI for the onboarding is almost complete. But the next thing we need is when we click on this button, we need to show this sign-in model. So let's create the UI for that. So I'm going to create a file, signin_view.dart. In this, first we're going to create this stateful widget, and I'm going to name it SignIn View. And it has a scaffold as a container. Now, currently we're designing this SignIn View, and in order to see the UI that we designed for this, let's temporarily add that in the main.dart file so that we can see the changes that we made. Now, scaffold requires a body, and in that I'm going to pass a safe area so that our content doesn't drop below the notch. And inside that, I'm going to add a single child scroll view. And the reason for that is the sign-in view will require an input later on. And the usual case on Flutter is when you have a lot of content on the screen and there's an input, you usually get the overflow error on the UI. So to avoid that, we can add a single child scroll view and give it a physics of never scrollable scroll physics. And as a child, I'm going to add a container, and this is also going to have another container. And the reason for that is the first container will act as a gradient border, and the second one will contain the main content. And the reason I'm using a container for a gradient border is because this will have a padding of 1, and there we will set the background that is the gradient, because I was not able to find some official way to set a gradient border in Flutter. So this is the approach that I found, and so do let me know if there's a better way to apply a gradient border in Flutter. Currently, I'm using this approach for this, and inside the inner container, I'm going to have a column as the content is going to be vertically aligned. Now next, I'm going to add a main axis size on the column to minimum so that the column only extends to the area that is required according to the size of its children. Now inside this, the first child is going to be the sign-in text, which is by default aligned to the top center. So for that, we can use a widget center to center align the content. Next, we're going to add a styling on this title, and as it is a title, I'm going to give it a big font size of 34. And on this text, we're going to use our custom font for title, that is Popness. Next, we're going to add the subtitle and give it a style of font family of Inter, font size of 17 and weight of 600. And let's center the text and add a spacing between these two. Now next, let's add also a margin on the container. Let's design the UI for the container, because currently we're not able to see what and where we are designing the UI. We're not able to see where the container starts or ends or anything. So first let's design the UI for the container, and then we will continue the design for the content. So for the design, we can use decoration, and inside this we're going to pass the color, that is secondary system background from Cupertino colors. And in order to use this, we have to import the package Cupertino.dart, and you can see a little like whitish type of color as a background. And next we're gonna need to add a shadow on the container. For that we're gonna use box shadow property, and inside that we're gonna use box shadow with color of shadow with 30% opacity. Now this shadow is from a custom theme that we have defined, and in order to use this we first have to import this. And if we check theme.dart, as I have explained earlier, we have defined some of the colors, the common colors that we're going to use throughout the application. And so we're using the shadow and with 30% opacity. Next, we're going to add the offset with width of 0 and height of 3. And give it a blur radius of 5. So it's going to give us a nice shadow on the container. We're going to add another shadow on top of that and give it the same color with an offset, this time 30, so that the shadow expands a little more on the container, and give it a blur radius of 30. Now we get a nice shadow around the container. Next, let's add a padding on the main container, the first container that I explained earlier that will act as a gradient border. So for that we're gonna give it a padding of 1, and next we're gonna set a background that is gonna be a linear gradient, and that the first color is gonna be white color with 0.8 opacity, and second is gonna be white color with 10% opacity. Now if you see in the course of this video, there may be some properties or styles which may not make sense. Like here, we're not really able to see the gradient borders. So just know that they are there because they are in the original. I'm using them just to keep the maximum similarities with the original application. And you can also find the same in the Figma prototype of the app. But of course, if you like change the color, or we may use dark theme or something, we can see the borders. But it's still interesting to learn about a way to apply gradient borders in Flutter. Next, we're gonna add padding inside the inner container, and that is gonna be 29. And the reason for that is it initially had to be 30, but the reason I'm using 29 because the outer container is already taking the 1 unit of the padding. So that's why I'm keeping it 29. Even if I keep 30, it wouldn't make much difference. So feel free to change it to 30, but right now I'm just gonna go with 29. Next, I'm gonna add a border radius on the container and also on the outer container. Now next, I'm applying a background blend mode luminosity. And the reason for that is to have a kind of a frosted glass effect that you usually see on the iOS UIs. And this kind of works with this particular color. It might not be for the others. So to have that effect, I'm using this blend mode. Again, let me know if there's a better solution to achieve that effect in Flutter. Right now, I'm just using this approach. Next, I'm gonna add the constant on the main container to have the max width of the model to 600. And this is applied by keeping in mind the bigger devices like tablet, desktop, or web, so that our model, the SignIn view, doesn't expand according to the bigger window size, because obviously it would not look good. So 600 seems reasonable for me. Feel free to change this to something else. Next, we're gonna add size box below the subtitle to have a little spacing, and below that we're gonna add an input, and this is the title for that, email. And we're gonna apply a style for this, and this is gonna be color secondary label, again from Cupertino colors, font family of enter, and font size of 15. Next, we're gonna add the text field, and we're gonna add a size box between to have spacing between them. Now the title is currently center by default, so to have it aligned to the left, you can wrap it around with the align widget and give it an alignment of center left. So now our text is aligned to the left. Next, repeat the same again for the second input, and this time it is password and the text field is obscure text, so that it acts as the password. Because if you click on it, you shouldn't be able to see the text that the user type on the input. Now let's add a spacing between these two. Now, as you see the input, it has a default styling that comes with the default input in Flutter. And we want to design a custom design for this input. And as we have two input, the code for this styling is going to be repeated. So to avoid a repetition, I'm gonna create a common function outside and have it return the input decoration. So before we apply this style, let's add this function as a decoration on these two input so that we can see the changes on real time. Okay, let's add design to this. First, I'm gonna add a full color to white. And it's not gonna work, so for that we have to apply another field that is filled and set it to true. Now we can see the white background. Next, let's add the enable border property and give it a border radius of 10 and border side of black with 10% opacity. So now we have a style, but the problem is this style is getting applied, but as we click on the input, it resets back to its original style. So to avoid that, we need to add another property and give that the same style that we have applied on the enable border. And now, even if we click on it, the style stays the same. Next, we also need to add a prefix icon on these inputs. And that is going to be different based on the input that we're using. So for the email, it's going to be the email icon and the password is going to be the log icon. So that needs to be dynamic. So for that, I'm going to create a parameter, icon name, and have both of these pass the name of the asset that they're going to use. Like for the email, it's going to be icon email, and for password, it's going to be icon log. And this is, by the way, the name of the asset that we're going to be using. This is for email, and this is for password. Now, in order to use this, we have to add a property, prefix icon, and give it an image asset and pass the path. And the name of the file is going to be dynamically set using the parameter that we have created. Now we have our icon as a prefix to the input. Let's add a padding to reduce the padding a little bit, and also add a padding around the icon so that we have some space before the icon. And let's give it a value of 4. Now UI for the input is done. Next, add spacing below the password text input and add a Cupertino button. Now this is the sign in button, and for that we're going to be using Cupertino button. That is also used from the Cupertino package. The onPress callback is going to provide us the event when the user touches on the button. And as a child, it's going to take a row, and inside that we're going to first pass the arrow icon. Now it doesn't have any style, so let's give it a background of this color. Now this one is showing a wrong color. The correct color is this one. Now let's center the icon on the button. So I'm going to give it a man axis alignment to center. And next, add the label for the button, that is sign in, and give it a style of font size of 17, font family of Inter, and font weight of bold. Now let's add a size box between these two to have a little spacing between these two. Next, I'm going to add a border radius on the button, and this button is going to have a different border radius on the corners. So for the top left, it's going to be 8. And for the other 3, it's going to be 20. And it's going to look like this. Let's also add a padding to increase the size of the button. Now next thing we need is some shadow on the button. For that, we're going to have to wrap it around with a container. And inside the container, we're going to pass a decoration property. And inside that, we're going to use box shadow, which is going to be the same color as the button with 50% opacity. Next, I'm going to add a blur radius of 20 and offset value of width 0 and height of 10. and it's going to provide a nice shadow around the button. Next, I'm going to add next property below. So I'm going to add text or and give it a style of black with 30% opacity and font size of 15 and font family of Inter. Next, I'm going to wrap it around with a padding to have some spacing between this and the button, and I'm going to give it a property of vertical padding of 24. And next, we're going to add divider on the left and right of this text, and also add some padding around this text, which is going to be 8 horizontal. Next, I'm going to add a footer text that is sign up with email, Apple or Google, and give it a style of color from Cupertino colors, that is secondary label, and font family of Inter and font size of 15. And next, we're going to add a row which is going to contain few different icons, that is the logo Apple, email, and Google, which is the extra option that user can use to sign into the app. Now, to have some little spacing between them, I'm going to add a property of space between of the main axis alignment, and it's going to add a little spacing between these three images. Next, I'm going to add a spacing between the footer text and the images, that is going to be 24. Now, our UI for the sign-in modal is almost complete, but the last thing we need is the close button on the modal, because we will use this as a modal and we need a button to close the modal. But that button is going to be independent of this UI that's going to be rendered above the content. So for that, we're going to have to wrap this whole container around with a stack widget. And after the container, we're going to add a Cupertino button, because of course it is a button to close the modal. And we are using Cupertino button to have the opacity touch effect. Now it's going to take the onPress callback to pass the event whenever the user click on the button, and it's going to take child, which is going to be a container. The container is going to contain an icon that is close, as you can see at the top right of the model. Next, I'm going to add a color for the icon to remove the by default that is blue, and now it is black. Next, I'm going to add some style on this button, and that is going to be the background color of white. Let's give it some fixed width and height, that is 36, and border radius of 18, that is the half of the 36. Let's also give it a box shadow, and that's going to be the shadow from our theme with 30% opacity, and blur radius of 5, and offset of with 0 and height of 3. Next, currently it is by default aligned to the top left of the container, and we want it at the bottom, so I'm going to wrap it around with a position widget and give it a bottom property of 0, so that it is aligned to the bottom. And to align it to the center, we also have to provide the left and right property to 0. Now it is centered. Now the button needs to be a little outside the container area. So what happens is that when you use some inbuilt widget from Flutter, like button, so whenever we use a button like material button, text button, or icon button, or in this case Cupertino button, they comes with some default styling or touch effect for them. Like this one has the opacity touch effect, and it also has some other default padding and other things. All that we want from this is the opacity touch effect. So we have to remove these default styling. So for that, let's temporarily add a background on this button. And if you add, as you can see, there are a few different issues with the button. That is the first, it is extending to the whole width of the screen. Second, it has some default padding. So first, we're going to remove the padding by setting it to 0, and it is removed. Next, as you can see, it still has some spacing after the button, so we have to set the min size to 36. That is the same as the width and height that we provided to the button. So that is also removed, and if you see, when we click on it, it is expanding to the whole view of the screen. So to avoid that, we can wrap this around with the align widget and pass the alignment to center. This will center the child, that is the button, and it will only take the area that is required. Now last thing, as you can see, it is still going outside the required area for the button. So we can also move that by passing it a border radius of 18. Now it's only gonna take the area that is required for this button. Now that is done, we can safely remove this color from this button. So our UI for the sign-in view is completed. Now the next part is to integrate this inside onboarding view to show as a model. So let's go back to the onboarding view and import the sign-in view, and I'm gonna add it after the safe area like this. And to see the change, we have to change the default screen to onboarding. Now it's not showing because the next thing we need to do is currently the default background for this sign-in view is this white background, and we don't really need that because it is going to act as a model, and the background should be the onboarding UI. So to remove this white background, we can set the background color to the scaffold container, and I'm going to set it to transparent. And now we can see our background, that is onboarding view. Now currently it is showing above the UI, onboarding UI, and we don't want that. Initially it should be outside the screen and only show by translating from the top when we click on the button. So to achieve that, we have to apply some animation. And for that, I'm going to use animation controller, and I'm going to name it _signin anim controller. Next, we need to initialize this controller inside init state, and this animation controller requires some parameters. So I'm going to pass the duration. This is the duration of the animation. Next, I'm going to pass the upper bound, that is the maximum value for this animation. Now by default it is already 1, but you can change this value to anything according to your convenience or whatever the requirement of your animation is. Next, it requires the vsync, and we need to pass the reference to the current class inside this. And currently it is showing the error because the class that we pass needs to use a ticker provider. So for that, and that is mixin. So for that we have to use the ticker provider state mixin, and we can use that using this syntax by adding with.ticker provider state mixin. And now the error is gone. Now that we have initialized the controller, we also have to dispose it in the dispose callback to avoid any memory leaks. So the controller is initialized. Next thing is using that as an animation. So to apply the animation, I'm going to use AnimatedBuilder and return the sign-in view inside the builder function. And the AnimatedBuilder also requires another parameter, that is animation, and that specifies the animation or controller that this AnimatedBuilder depends on. That is the one that we created, sign-in anim controller. Now the animation for the sign-in view that we require is the transform, so that it translates from the top. So for that, I'm going to wrap this around with a transform.translate widget and use the property offset. Now the x value for this is going to be 0 because we don't need to animate anything horizontally. We need the animation vertically. So the y value is going to be minus media query and .size.height. Now this is basically the screen height of the device. So whatever the device you run this on, whether Android or iOS, it will return the total height of the screen. So putting it in minus means that initially the UI, the sign-in view, is going to be outside the screen or at the top. If this value is 0, that means it is sign-in view is is at its original position, that is what you see here. And when we change this to minus screen height, it is outside the screen at the top. Next, to apply the animation on this, because we need to translate the SignIn view with an animation, so we have to multiply this with this property. Now, to understand this, initially the controller value is going to be 0. That is the initial state of this animation. So the value is going to be 1 minus 0. So screen height multiplied by 1, that is going to be minus screen height. So the SignIn view is going to be outside the screen at the top. And as we apply the animation, the value is slowly going to change to 1, 0 to 1, and the final value is going to be 1 minus 1, 0. And 0 multiplied by screen height is going to be 0. So if the y value is 0, then of course the view is at its original position. That is what you see here. This is the original position of this view. So that is what this animation does. And now we have applied this. We're getting this error. We have to refresh the view. Now nothing happens because as we have applied the animated animation on the SignIn view, and currently it is outside the screen because the default value is 0 and the value for the y offset is minus screen height, so it is outside the screen. Now on the click of the button, we have to apply the animation so that it slowly translates to the UI. So for that, as you know, on click of the button, we are setting the isActive value to true. So in order to perform the animation, we have to wait for the animation to complete, and then we will show the UI. So in the init state callback, we can use a controller, and inside this we can use isActiveChanged, which is a listenable, means it will notify us whenever the isActive value of the controller change. And from this listenable, we can listen to the change of this property. So whenever the value changes from true to false or vice versa, it will notify us. And inside this, we only want to perform the animation where the animation is completed. So when initially it is false, when we click on it, it changes to true, and as the animation completes, it resets back to false. And so that is the case we want to show the model, because we want the animation to first complete to show the user the complete touch effect. So I'm going to add a condition, button controller .isActive is false. Only then we will add the animation, and inside this I'm going to add the controller, and I'm going to use the function AnimatedWidth, which requires a property, a parameter of simulation. So for that effect, I'm going to use spring simulation to have some spring effect on the transition. And this simulation needs to be imported from physics.dart package. Now the spring simulation requires some parameters like the spring description, start and velocity value. We can define the spring description here, which also needs some properties like mass, stiffness, damping, etc. to control the smoothness of the transition. So this is the values that we're going to be using. And next, we can pass this value inside the spring simulation. The description is going to be what we created. Start value is going to be 0, end value is going to be 1, means the animation is 0 to 1, and velocity we can set to 0. Lastly, we're going to set this inside AnimatedWidth function. And now when we save, it's not going to work. Probably we need to refresh the app for it to work. And now when we click on it, as you can see, SignIn model is smoothly translating from the top. So our transition, the model transition is complete. Next thing is we need to also provide a functionality to close the model. Currently when we click on this button, nothing happens, and this button is supposed to close the model. So for that, I'm going to create a new property, a callback, and use this in the constructor. And lastly, on the button callback, the onPress callback for this button, we're going to call this callback. And when we go back to the onboarding view, we can use this callback inside this SignIn view, and in this function we can just reverse the animation. So what's going to happen is that initially when we apply the animation here, it changes the value from 0 to 1, and when we close the model, it will reverse it, means it's going to change it back to 1 to 0, resulting in reverse animation that you just saw. So we show the model and we can close the model. Now the next thing our model needs is a backdrop. So we need to show some background overlay above the onboarding view to show it as a model. Currently it is looking almost a part of the UI, and it needs to be separate. So to show some background overlay, we're going to be adding a background. So for that I'm going to be using stack, and inside this I'm going to use position.fill to fill whatever the view that we use, and that is going to be a container. Background color as shadow. And to use shadow, we have to import the theme.dart file in the class. Now it is showing, but this is not what we want, and also it is blocking the UI. So we're going to add opacity for this container and give it a value of 0.4 multiplied by the animation value. So initially the controller value is going to be 0, so opacity is going to be 0, means it is not going to show. And when the animation changes to 1, the final value is going to be 0.4, so it's going to show a little dipped background behind the SignIn model. Now when we save it, it is currently not showing, but if I click on it, you see that it is also blocking our interaction with the main UI, and we don't want that. To avoid that, we can wrap this around with the ignore pointer and set the ignoring value to true. Now we can interact with the UI. The UI is showing, and also the backdrop for the model is also visible. With a smooth animation, as it is also depends on the controller. So our model is almost complete. Last thing we need is, when we show the model, we also need to translate the content of the onboarding UI. So as the model will show, the content of the UI, that is this title, button and all that, is going to shift a little up. So for that I'm going to be using AnimatedBuilder again, but on the content. So I'm going to wrap this safe area around with the AnimatedBuilder and have it passed as a child for the AnimatedBuilder. Now inside this, I'm going to pass the animation that this AnimatedBuilder depends on, that is SignIn and control. And next I'm going to use the builder function and return the child. And builder is basically where we provide the logic for the animation. And currently what we have done here is that we have passed our main UI as a child to the AnimatedBuilder. And that is because when the animation that our AnimatedBuilder depends on changes, the AnimatedBuilder rebuilds the builder function. So it kind of repaints the stuff that we provide here. And we can also directly use this inside the builder and return it. But the problem is, the content of the UI does not need to change as the animation changed. We are only translating it. So we can instead pass that as a child of the AnimatedBuilder, so it will catch it and use it in the animation. So it will not rebuild this every time. It will only apply the animation that we need to perform. And to perform the animation, we're going to wrap this child around with the transform widget, and going to use the transform property, and we're going to use the translation matrix for this as a value, which requires 3 values, x, y, and z. So the x and z is going to be 0 and y is going to be minus 50, as we want to shift the content a little up. So it's just going to shift a little by minus 50 pixels. And next, we're going to multiply this -50 value with controllers same as we did, similar logic as we did here. So what's going to happen initially is going to be 0. So this value is going to be 0. So it's going to be in its original position, which is this. And as the model shows, this value is going to be 1. So it's going to be moved back to the -50 position. And now if we save this and show the model, you can see the content is translating up a little bit with the transition of the model. Now in the end, we're going to wrap this SignIn view AnimatedBuilder in a RepaintBoundary, which is a change from a performance perspective. Now to understand RepaintBoundary, there's a video by a Fun with Flutter channel. So if you want to understand about this in detail, you can check that out. I'll put the link in the description. But just to give you a little brief, in Flutter, when you apply some animation or transition on a widget, Flutter repaints them to show you the animation, which in turns usually repainting the sibling widgets that are on the same layer, which can be an expensive task. So if we wrap that widget with a repaint boundary, Flutter put that in a separate layer so that any change on its child wouldn't cause repaint on other widgets on the screen. Like in our case, SignIn view is kind of a separate from onboarding, as it is a model. Now for a small non-complex UI, the change would hardly be noticeable. But for a big complex application, it can make a real difference. But of course, this widget also shouldn't be used extensively as it is a CPU and memory expensive task. So it's important to check proper use cases before wrapping everything with a repaint boundary. Now next we need to add the validation on these SignIn input fields, so that when the fields are empty, we're going to show the error, and if they are filled, we're going to show the success and the confetti. So let's go back to the SignIn view, and first thing we need is a way to get the text that the user have typed on these fields. So for that, I'm going to create a controller for the email and same for the password. And as these are controller, we also have to dispose them in the dispose callback to avoid any memory leaks. Next, we're going to assign these controllers to these two input fields, the email controller to the email field and the password controller to the password field. Now, whatever the text that user type on these fields, we can access them through these two controllers. Now that we have the data and a way to get the text from the fields, let's render the Rive assets so that we can show the loading and the check and the success and animations and all that. So to render the asset, after the container, I'm gonna add a position.filled widget, and as a child, I'm gonna pass a stack because I'm gonna add two different Rive assets. The first one is gonna be the check, that's gonna show the loading, the success and error animation, and the second one is gonna be the confetti. So I'm gonna add a Rive animation widget and pass the path to the check.rive file. And of course, in order to use the Rive animation widget, we have to import the Rive package. But the problem is now, as you see, I'm getting a error on the linear gradient line, and the reason is because the same class is defined on two different packages, the Flutter one and the second is the Rive package. And as currently we're not using this from the Rive package, we can safely hide this from the import. So now the error is gone. So what happens is that it's going to import the Rive package but without this class. And now as you see, we are able to see our Rive animation. Currently it is by default showing the error, so you can safely ignore that because later on we're going to control this manually based on the input that user provides. Now currently the Rive animation, the asset is too big, so I'm going to provide a fixed width and height to the asset, and now it's much better. Now currently the default alignment of this asset is the top left in the model, so I'm going to pass an alignment property on the stack widget and the value to center. Now it is centered properly. Now also if I click on the input, you can see that this asset is blocking our interaction with the UI, as I'm not able to click on the input because of this. So we don't want that. So avoid this. We can wrap this stack around with an ignore pointer and pass the ignoring value to true. Now we can safely interact with the input even if I click above this asset. Now another thing, this asset is by default showing and is not the expected behavior, as we only want to show this when we click on this button. So for this, I'm going to create a variable is loading and add a condition here that if is loading is true, only then we will show this asset. And later on, we're going to set this to true when we click on this button. So that part is done. Next, we need to get some reference to this asset in order to control the animation that we have inside this. As this asset have few different animations like the loading, check, and error and all that. So we can do that using an onInit callback that we get from these widget, and I'm going to create a function onCheck Rive init at the top. So I've created the function, and also that onInit callback also provide us a parameter that is the Artboard. Now what is the Artboard? An Artboard is, if you see on the Rive editor, an Artboard is this. So whatever in the Rive editor we put as in this particular area where we define a particular animation, these different assets, this different state, the state machine, the inputs and all that. So that is the Artboard, and this Artboard then gives us access to these different state machine and inputs and all that, through which in the code we can control this animation. So let's go back to the code, and using this Artboard we can get reference to the controller. And so I'm going to create a variable controller, and we can get reference to the controller using state machine controller using the function from Artboard. And this requires two parameters. The first is mainly the two parameters. The third one is optional. The first one is Artboard that we get from the onInit callback, and we can pass this here. And the second parameter is the state machine name. And now the state machine name is this one here, and it needs to be exactly the same as it is defined here. Now just to give you a little brief on what a state machine in Rive is, all that you see below are the different state of this animation. Like this is the error, this is AND, this is check, filling circle, and this is the loading state which you can play, and this is the default state. So a state machine basically binds them all together, as you can see in the graph here. And through these input we can define a different sequence of state that it needs to go through to play a certain animation. Like if I play this, the default state is loading, and if I trigger the check input, it's going to go through these three different states: the default state, filling circle, and check to play the success animation. Similarly, if I trigger the reset input, it's going to go back to the loading state, and if I trigger the error input, it's going to go through this default state and error state to play the error animation. So this is what it basically is, and we're going to use it similarly in our application. Through the state machine, we're going to get reference to the inputs and trigger them based on the validation. Like if the fields are empty, then we're going to trigger the error animation, and if the fields are valid, then we're going to trigger the success animation. Now the creation of this animation is also not covered in the original course, as it is provided by the community. As you can see at the top here, this particular animation is created by this user. And you can find similar interesting animation if you go to the community section of official Rive website. There are many interesting animations created by the community, so you can check them out. And also, if you want to understand how a particular animation is created and what happens under the hood, you can click the preview and Rive section and see what happens under the hood and how a particular animation is created. And if you want to download a particular animation, you can go to the options at the top and download that particular animation and play with it if you want. So check them out if you want, and let's go back to the code. So next, we're gonna set the controller that we have got from this to the artboard. And through this controller, we can next get reference to these three inputs that we have defined here: this check, error, and reset. So in order to use that, I'm going to create a variable which is SMIT trigger, and I'm going to name it _success_anim, and I'm going to do the same for error animation. Next, in order to get these the value for these, we can get these from the controller reference using the find input function, and we have to pass the exact value of that particular input. And we're going to do the same for the error animation, and we also have to provide the exact name of this input. Now we're not going to be using the reset animation because from my experience it didn't really make much use on this use case, because everything was working fine even if we don't use that. So I'm not going to be using it, but feel free to use that and make use of that if you want to. So now that we got the reference for these, next create the validation logic so that we can trigger these different animation based on the input. So I'm going to create a reference to a function login, and now we're going to create the login function. And inside this login function, the first thing we're going to do is set the isLoading_state to true, so that as soon as user click on this button, we can show the loading animation. Let's save and let's give it a try. So now when I click on it, you can see it is continuously showing us the loading state. But it is keep going, and we have to add some validation so that after some time this Rive asset change its state to show either success or failure. So next I'm going to create a variable, and it's going to store the validation for the email input. So if the input is not valid, then it's going to be true. I'm going to do the same for the password input, and I'm going to create another variable, and if the both fields are valid, that means user have entered something here, anything, then that value will be true. So now to use this, I'm going to create a future delayed, so that after a delay we're going to show a particular state of this animation, either success or error. Now just to clarify, as it is a demo application, we're not going to be doing some complex logic here. So that's why we are added future delayed, and inside this first we need to pass the duration. So this is the time that we have to wait to get the callback from this, which is 1 second, and the second parameter is the callback. So after 1 second we're going to get some callback inside this method, and inside this I'm going to add a condition that if the input is valid, that user have filled both of the fields, then we're going to trigger the success animation, and if it is not valid, that either of the input are empty, then we're going to show the error animation. So let's save this and let's refresh this, and if we try this now, after 1 second it's going to show us the error animation because the fields are not valid. Now another issue is that after it shows the error, it is not hiding automatically, so we also have to handle that. So we're going to add another delay, and after 3 seconds we're going to set the isLoading value to false, so it's going to show us the success or error, and after 3 seconds or 2 seconds after the last callback, it's going to hide the loading asset. Let's refresh this and give it a try. Now if I click on this, it's going to show us the error and hide after that. Similarly, if we fill the fields, it's going to show us the success and hide after that. So this is done. Now the next part is, after we show the success, we also need to show the confetti animation. So let's go back to the code, and after the check Rive widget, I'm going to add position.fill and provided the confetti Rive widget with the path to the confetti file. And I'm also going to provide a fixed width and height, and this is the dimension that is provided to this animation in the Rive editor. Now if you save this, we also don't need to add this condition here, as by default it's going to be invisible, and as we have also added ignore pointer, it's also not going to block our interaction with the UI. So even if you want to add this, it wouldn't make much difference. So now the next thing is, in order to use this, we need a reference to this animation. So we're going to do the same thing as we did the check animation. We're going to use the callback on init, and for that we're going to need to create this function. So let's go back to the top, and I'm going to create this function, and inside this we're going to do the same thing as we did here, getting the reference to the controller from Artboard function from this class, and passing it the Artboard that we got from the param and the state machine name, and adding that controller to the Artboard. Now the state machine name for this is also state machine 1, and if you see the Rive editor, by default it is invisible and there is only one input. So if we trigger it, it's gonna play as the confetti animation. So we're gonna get reference to this input in the code and trigger this similar animation in our code also. So let's go back to the code. So in order to get the reference to the input, I'm going to create a variable SMIT trigger confetti anim, and inside this I'm going to use the find input function from the controller and pass it the exact name of the input, that is trigger explosion, and typecast that to the SMIT trigger. Next, we need to call this input somewhere in order to trigger this. So I'm going to use that in the 3-second callback. So I'm going to add a condition if the input was valid, because remember we only need to show the confetti if the input was valid and the success animation is shown. So if the input was valid, we're going to trigger the confetti animation. So let's give it a try. First let's refresh the application and let's fill the input. It's going to load success and confetti. Now if you see, the confetti widget is very small, so we can fix that by wrapping it around with a transform.scale and passing the scale value to 3. So it's going to 3x to its original size, that is 500. So let's give it a try now. It's going to place the loading, success and the confetti. Now the confetti animation is big enough to see. Now that I think of it, you can also achieve the same thing by simply setting the width and height to 1500, as the aspect ratio is 1:1. So you can do that, and it's gonna do the same thing as it did with this. But for now, I'm just gonna go with this one. Next, after we show the confetti, we need to close the model. So I'm gonna add another condition after the 3-second callback, that if the input was valid, we're going to add another future delayed, and this time 4 seconds or 1 second after we play the confetti animation, and inside this we're going to close the model. And we also need to clear the inputs so that the next time user open the SignIn model, field should be empty. Now let's give it a try, and it's going to close the model after the confetti animation. Now lastly, just to avoid multiple call to this function, we can add a condition here that this function should only be called if the validation is not in progress. That means the isLoading value is false. So that when user click on the sign in button multiple times, it wouldn't call this every time and repeat the same thing for every click. So now our onboarding, custom sign-in model, validation are completed. So basically one module of this application is completed. In the next video, we're going to learn how to create this custom bottom tab bar with these animated icons from scratch. And we're also going to create the UI for this main screen. So stay tuned, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.